Okay, well, I promise this final session before lunch will be informative, entertaining, and energetic, and we'll finish on time. And then, of course, this afternoon we'll wrap up with all our lessons learned. So I am taking a lesson from Chris Ross, my good friend, who showed you mathematics. Oh, and then from Robert, who read us legislation. I'm going to talk about standards. Now, I don't know, many of you have probably worked on standards, and let me just frame it. Right? There are people who are forest folks and people who are tree folks. Well, standards are bark people. And what I mean by that is we are often very focused on the minute details that are necessary for this thing we call interoperability. Now, Ken, yesterday a couple of people were adventurous and tried to define interoperability. So actually, let me start with that. So I was talking to the leads of the Senate Help Committee about what is the definition of interoperability, because I wanted to actually see what our senators thought. And our senators told me it's every data element in your lifetime medical record exchanged with every stakeholder for every purpose in real time for free. Now, if that is your definition of interoperability, I mean, Ken, we actually might want to go home because we're not going to quite get to that point for a while. But there is a journey we have been on, and I promise I'll keep it brief, that I think each of you should understand why we are where we are today. And I need to start with some interesting not health history. Now, folks watch, Bill Nye, the science guy on occasion, right? He can take extremely complex ideas, reduce them to simple demonstrations, and then you sort of say, oh, okay, that makes sense. So I need to start with the shipping industry. Now, this is a slide you probably can't read, but, it will go into the record. So how many folks know the Malcolm McLane, how does the shipping container get invented story? Okay, nobody. Great. So here's the issue, is a guy's a trucker in the 1930s, and he brings a bunch of stuff to a port. And then there's a whole team of longshoremen and a lot of queues that you just wait in because you have to get the stuff hand lifted off your truck by a longshoreman and then put into a rope bag and then lowered onto a ship. And everything, just as we've heard from all the panelists before us, are serial queues to which it is unlikely the trucker will be leaving for hours, right? So what did Malcolm do? He said, well, what if instead of longshoremen and rope bags, we actually had containers? And that's a great idea. Why don't, in fact, we'll come up with a standard for how big a container is so they all fit nicely together in cubes. And then all the trucks will just show up to the port with these standard containers. Sort of a really great idea. The only problem is there was no ship that could actually carry a standard container, and there was no crane that could lift a container off a truck and put it on a ship. So what did he do? He said, I'm actually going to go build a ship that is going to be the first of its kind that will actually hold all these standardized containers. So you can see in this timeline, in 1950, there were some early experiments with containers, wartime, but then in 56, Malcolm built a ship and drove a bunch of trucks with a bunch of standardized containers to the one ship in the world that could accept them and said, oh, it actually kind of worked. The only problem was there was no crane at any port. And so then in 1959, they finally built a crane in a port that could actually accept these containerized shipping trucks and put them onto ships. And today, 700 million containers go on containerized ships with cranes at every port, and no longshoremen basically exist. And all of this is now done in an extraordinarily efficient and lower cost way. Now, why do I tell you all that? Because inventing the container wasn't helpful. It was only when you got the ships that could carry the containers and the cranes to put them on the ships that it actually became helpful. So in fact, although Malcolm had this brilliant idea, you had to completely change the workflow, completely change the skill sets, and completely change a lot of the infrastructure to make this new efficiency, which is today's shipping container business, happen. So think about this for a moment in healthcare. For 30 years, we've created a bunch of pieces and parts of interoperability, but we haven't fundamentally changed the healthcare system, the workflow, or the infrastructure. And so let me sort of tell you what we did, and then I will leave it to these brilliant people here to explain how it's going to work better in the future. Okay. See, Ken, I told you it's going to be dicey here. So in 1989, there were a bunch of folks, we'll call them the shipping container people. And they said, oh, we're going to create a lab system that's going to do great things with figuring out your blood counts or your serum sodiums. There's only one problem. There was no crane, right? You couldn't get that into the medical records of the day. So some brilliant people at HL7, this new organization that was founded in the late 80s, came up with what they said was HL7, and this particular form you see is called the version 2 HL7 standard. You can see it's a bunch of pipes and carrots, and each of those data elements you see is very well specified in a standard. You can see, oh, it is a patient name. That's the so-called PID segment. And it has a thing called an address and a phone number. Oh, and then there may be observations about the patient, the so-called OBX segment. Oh, and then there may be allergies, the so-called AL1 segment. And so this was actually a nice way of, for the very first time, if there were different components of technology, of shipping very selected bits of information between those components. And it's great. It's even used today. We've been talking about the ADT messages and how important it is to exchange them. Well, that PID segment that you see right there is even used in 2019 as the core of a whole lot of ADT message exchange. But here was the problem, is that everyone decided, oh, well, a name, well, let's see, we got a first name, a middle name, and a last name, right? It's all separated by carrots, it's all in pipes and all the rest. Oh, but what if you have a hyphenated name and a married name and 3 middle names? Or maybe you are from a country that uses a whole lot of family history and you're, oh, it doesn't work. The model had a lot of very well specified components, but it was not easily extensible or changeable or modifiable. And then we didn't know a lot about what I'm going to call the metadata. Where did the data come from? Who gathered it? What use for purpose is it? And so HL7 said, oh, we must evolve. And we're going to use the latest technology of the early 2000s, XML. And so the idea of XML, like HTML, is you can create tags. And those tags are very extensible, and they can contain all kinds of subparts and optionality, and that's all great. So I'm showing you pretty much the same information from that other message, but in a more modern XML format. So you can see street address, city, state, postal code, country. But if we encounter some place in the world that doesn't have a street, a city, a state, a postal code, or country, that's okay. We can invent another tag that is going to be useful for that country and add it to the standard. So it's very easy to extend, very easy to add lots of options and that sort of thing. And that optionality, that thing that sounded like such a blessing, became a curse. And what do I mean by that? Since, we got Cerner in the room, we got Epic in the room, if you look at Meditech, Athena, eClinicalWorks, everyone took this standard and said, well, here's how we have decided to implement it. And therefore, it was a standard that's great. And in fact, it was very easy to generate this kind of XML and extremely hard to parse it, to incorporate it, because you didn't quite know what to expect. And let me give you a not Epic, not Cerner example, just because I want to keep the peace here. I operate a variety of EHRs in the Boston area, and this really happened, Ken. We shipped a 900-page CCDA document to a primary care physician that met the standard to the letter, because it had, in fact, every blood pressure in an ICU stay, Q5 minutes for 3 weeks. But it met the standard, right? So that's fine. You can see we went from the thing that wasn't very flexible, the HL7v2, to the thing that was really, really flexible, but had way too much optionality. And then people said, it's just too hard. And in fact, you need PhDs to be able to dissect this and figure out the signal from the noise. So then what happened? And I actually got to tell the Washington, D.C. story so you understand how this all became a reality. So Obama saw this in 2014, and we had $31 billion in the Meaningful Use program, and said, I am not satisfied that this approach is going to result in better interoperability. So what did he do? He hired the Jasons. Now, if you don't know the Jasons, go look at Wikipedia, right? Through the MITRE Corporation, the Jasons convene as a group of very smart scientists to solve problems of the day. And the Jasons met in La Jolla in 2014, and did they interview a number of what I'll call the incumbents in the healthcare IT industry? Not so much. They talked to Amazon and Facebook and Google and Apple and said, how did you create an ecosystem where all of these products that we use every day share data and actually doesn't require PhDs? And they said, we use a technological approach called an API, an application program interface. And what does that mean? It means that we publish a little guide that says, when you send this, we'll send that. It's not all this optionality and all this arcane technology. And each of them happens to use a technique that's part of JavaScript. Now this again, Ken, I know I'm getting really on the edge here. So 2014 goes by. All of us who've been working on XML for all those years, we feel really bad. And so what do? 1 mile from where I'm standing, there is a Greek restaurant called the Agora. And we all sat around a table having hummus. And actually, Dave McCauley from Cerner was at this table. And we said, if we're going to follow the Jasons as we're eating this Greek food, let us call ourselves the Argonauts. We are going to slay the golden fleece and find the gorgons and all the rest of this stuff. And we are therefore going to create for the healthcare industry what Apple and Facebook and Google have done for their industries, an extremely straightforward set of resources that are specified in this JavaScript format so that any 26-year-old that wakes up and doesn't have a healthcare domain expertise or a PhD can know, oh, I see, if I need to query somebody's name and address, I can just send this and I'll get that. And it's totally unambiguous, and it's extremely simple, and it uses the same format that every other industry outside of healthcare uses to exchange data. And that became what are called the Argonaut Fire implementation guides. Very straightforward set of resources. Today, about 150 resources where we describe everything from problem lists and medication lists and allergies and labs to scheduling. And every year, as you've heard a little bit about this group, we ask the industry, what more do you need? And then we take the highest value use cases and expand them with more and more of these very straightforward application program interfaces. And here's the interesting aspect of this. The ONC and CMS notices of proposed rulemaking from February 11th require the country to do this. And, you know, standards should not be required until they're mature enough that they're fit for purpose. Apple chose to put the Fire Argonaut standard on every phone on the planet in iOS 11.3. So today, if you use HealthKit, that thing that has the heart, it's actually using this standard to grab your data from Epic, Cerner, and Meditech and the like. So, gee, if every phone already has it, and we've actually used it in many, many contexts, it seems like it's probably fit for purpose and therefore okay to require in regulation. So there was 30 years of standards making in a few minutes, and this is where we are, and this is where we're going. And don't worry, it's not that fire is going to save us all. It's that we have a couple of standards in our quiver. The HL7 V2 messages, you saw them, fit for some purpose. XML, fit for some purpose. Fire, fit for some purpose. Now let me get back to the shipping container. So think of fire as the crane. That's really all it is, right? It moves data. It moves shipping containers onto the ship. think of Cerner as the ship. These guys are the containers. And our goal today is to tell you each of them has a different view of what the container should do and how that container will fit into our healthcare ecosystem, but every one of them has incorporated standards and agreed to work on the Cerner ship. And so my professor at MIT, Pete Sullivan, always told me, leave the audience with a sort of a gold star idea, something you can remember. So think about it. What we want the VA to do is ensure that the ship, which is Cerner, can hold a variety of standardized containers produced by a whole variety of innovators and use the standards that are necessary to crane them over to the ship. That is our goal today. So let me introduce our panel. So we have 4 of the greatest innovators that I could find, because these folks are creating real products and real services that are making real impacts across our country today, and they are not EHR vendors, right? They are service providers that work with EHR vendors and provide this real value-added service to enhance patient and doctor and other staff experience. So we have Graham Gardner, who is the CEO of Kairos. We have Adil Yang, who's the CEO of Medumo. We have Oliver Carrez, who is the CEO of ZocDoc. And we have Spencer Cross, who I wanted to call him the CEO, but he said Supreme Commander would be fine. He is a product director for Change Healthcare. So let me turn it over to Graham next, and you will hear about each of their products and services, and then we'll reflect at the end how these can help the VA.